Our chief guest, Dr. Kim Yong Kim, the Vice Chairman and Partner at the Global Infrastructure Partners and the 12th President of the World Bank Group from 2012 to 2019, President of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Kiwumi Adesina, Minister of Planning and Development for Côte d'Ivoire, Ms. Kabanyala, represented by Isabella Kafo, heads of diplomatic missions in Côte d'Ivoire, representatives of the African Union, the European Union, ECOWAS, and other international organizations, members of the Executive Board of Directors and staff of the African Development Bank Group, distinguished guests, members of the audience who are tuning in from various parts of the world, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2023 Kofi Annan Eminent Speakers Lecture Series. Today, it's an honor of having Dr. Kim Yong Kim, the former president of the World Bank Group. He's the vice chairman and partner of the Global Infrastructure Partners, a fund that invests in infrastructure projects across several sectors worldwide. Your Excellency, Dr. Kim, you are most welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Solomon Mugera, Director of Communication and External Relations for the African Development Bank Group, and it's an honor to be your host today on such a memorable Friday afternoon. If you are on social media, join the conversation using hashtag Eminent Speakers. And if you make any comments, we will get some of them to share with our chief guest and the President of the African Development Bank. So let's get started. And may I invite to the podium the bank's chief economist and vice president for economic governance and knowledge management, Professor Kevin Chika Urama. Round of applause for him, please.
Thank you. Ms. Isabella Akafu, representative of Her Excellency Ms. Niele Kaba, the AFDB Governor for Côte d'Ivoire, Minister for Economy, Planning and Development, Dr. Kiwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, Her Excellency Ms. Josephine Kala, Special Representative of the Chairperson of the African Union and Head of the African Union Liaison Office in Côte d'Ivoire, Her Excellency Ms. Francesca Mauro, Ambassador of the European Union to Côte d'Ivoire, Her Excellency Ms. Fanta Cisse, Resident Representative of Economic Community of West African States in Côte d'Ivoire, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Executive Directors of the African Development Bank Group, Senior Management of the African Development Bank Group, representatives from the international organizations, civil society, and the academia, media houses, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is really my profound privilege and pleasure to make these opening remarks for this 2023 Kofi Annan Eminent Speakers Lecture Series. The lecture was launched by the African Development Bank in 2006 as one of the bank's fora for generating, disseminating, and brokering cutting-edge knowledge to shape Africa's development, growth, and sustainable development on the continent. This lecture series over the years have brought several eminent speakers, including heads of states, prime ministers, Nobel laureates, and distinguished people of the academia, the private sector, to discuss several topics bearing on Africa's development. Today, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Kim Yong Kim, Vice President and Partner at Global Infrastructure Partners and former President of the World Bank Group, who has graciously accepted President Kiwumi Adesina's invitation to be the 2023 Eminent Speaker for this year. He will be speaking to us on a topic which is dear to everyone's hearts today, the changing global development finance architecture and the implications for multilateral development banks post-COVID-19. Focusing on this topic is very clear for us, the reasons why we chose this topic with Jim Kim, because the structure of the current global financing architecture, the flow of global financing for development in Africa, but also the scale of global financing to Africa, we've seen in several ways that they shortchange development on the continent. So the need for discussing how to reform this architecture in order to be better fit for purpose today cannot be gainsaid. So without much further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank Group, to welcome to the virtual podium the 2023 Kofi Annan Eminent Speaker, Dr. Jim Yong Kim, to the African Development Bank's Eminent Speakers Lecture Series today. Mr. President, help us cut the ribbons.
Our eminent speaker, my dear friend, Dr. Jim Yong Kim, Your Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, and let me give special recognition for Our Excellency Francesca Di Mauro, Ambassador of the European Union for Côte d'Ivoire, Our Excellency Isabel Akfu, representing Our Excellency Nelly Kaba, AFDB Governor for the bank, and also Minister of Planning and Development. Let me welcome Her Excellency Fanta Sise, resident representative of the Economic Community of West African States, executive directors of the African Development Bank, ambassadors that are represented, heads of international missions, and senior management and staff of the bank, all guests joining us virtually from around the world, members of the press, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great delight to welcome you all to the 2023 Kofi Annan Eminent Speaker Lecture. Every time that we hold this prestigious lecture, I have such warm memories of late Mr. Annan, the former UN Secretary General. He was such an incredible leader, a great mentor to me personally. His life was exemplary. His leadership was endearing and inclusive, and his wisdom, calmness, and thoroughness and forthrightness always got all of us to reflect deeply on issues, question long-held assumptions on positions, all with our eyes focused on improving the conditions around the world. Whether it was the Sustainable Development Goals, global security issues, conflicts, global pandemics, food insecurity, governance, his voice will always resonate. Now, one of Kofi Annan's quotes that is apt for today that I like very much says, and I quote him, "We need to create a world that is equitable, that is stable, a world where we bear in mind that the needs of others and not only what we need matters immediately. We are all in the same boat," and he went on to aptly put it, "one leak in the boat and we all sink together." The challenges of our world today, from COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, rising debt, food insecurity, and conflicts, are keeping the lead on development globally. The global development boat is leaking, and the consequences will be devastating unless we seal the leaking areas. At the top of the leakage is climate change, which poses existential risks for the world. We must do all we can to keep global warming at no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. We need innovations to power the world better with renewable energy. Another leakage, there's too much hunger in the world. It is not acceptable that over 2.3 billion people in the world go to bed hungry every single day. God did not create stomachs to go empty. He created them to be filled. There must be a hunger-free world. Another leakage: inability to cope with global health pandemics. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us how important it is to have global pandemic preparedness and to ensure no one is left behind in access to affordable health care. After all lives matter. General Antonio Guterres recently raised the alarm that the world is off course on meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, our SDGs, our collective agreement to shape a better world for all. A better world for 940 million people that are without or insurance. A better world, I must say, for 50 million children that are out of school, including 129 million girls. Yet, this is all happening in the midst of stupendous wealth in the world. Total assets under management by institutional investors will soon reach $1.145 trillion US. Inequalities are expanding rapidly. Oxfam International put out a press release on the 13th of January of this year with a screaming headline: the richest 1% bag nearly twice as much as wealth as the rest of the world put together over the past 2 years. Just think about that. They continued. They grabbed nearly 2/3 of all new wealth worth $42 trillion created since 2020. The challenge facing the world is therefore not lack of resources. It is that the resources are highly concentrated in developed countries with few extremely rich around the world, while the world's development boat is leaking. The international community has a critical role to play to change this. Yet, as Kofi Annan reminds us in one of his statements, and I quote, "The international community allows nearly 3 billion people, almost half of all humanity, to subsist on $2 or less a day in a world of unprecedented wealth." In Africa, development financing needs are huge and widening. The African Development Bank estimates that Africa needs a financing gap of $1.2 trillion through 2030 to finance the SDGs and to adapt to climate change. For example, the financing requirements for Africa's nationally determined contributions under the Paris Climate Agreement are estimated at $277 billion annually through 2030. Current flows of climate finance to Africa fall way short of that, at just $30 billion in 2019 and 2020. Much of the available climate finance is concentrated in a few developed countries, and very little is available in support of climate adaptation, which is, of course, Africa's most serious challenge. There is no doubt, therefore, that the global financial architecture is failing development in the world as it faces multiple global challenges. The global financial architecture needs to be reformed and transformed to tackle more effectively global challenges and to accelerate the achievement of sustainable development goals. We must ensure equal opportunities for all. Regardless of one's economic, social, or racial background, we must create a level playing field for a more just, fair, and equitable world. Multilateral development banks like ourselves play a unique role of tackling global development challenges. By their nature, they are positioned to respond to global economic shocks, finance the needs of sustainable development goals, address rising fragility, and mobilize financing required to address climate change. It is estimated that the new global challenges will require a tripling of financing for multilateral development banks and a doubling of bilateral aid, a significant increase in concessional lending, and a massive increase, in particular, in inflows of private capital. The clarion call is from billions of dollars to trillions of dollars. The G20 has called for significantly raising the ambition of multilateral development banks, expanding resources for them to do more, improving their ability to take risks, optimizing their balance sheets, deploying more financial innovations, and leveraging the private sector. Critically, they need to work collectively as a system to effectively deploy knowledge, risk mitigation instruments, and concessional financing at scale. And that's why we have selected the theme of the 2023 Kofi Annan Eminent Speaker Lecture to be the changing global financial architecture, implications for multilateral development banks post-COVID-19. This topic is timely, and this lecture comes just a week after the World Bank IMF annual meetings in Marrakesh, Morocco, the first time in 50 years since the two global financial institutions held their annual meetings on the continent. A month ago also, the discourse on the global development financial architecture was at the heart of our discussions at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. There is, ladies and gentlemen, no better person to speak on this issue than our eminent speaker today, Dr. Jim Yong Kim. Dr. Kim is a globally respected leader. He served as the 12th president of the World Bank Group from 2012 to 2019. He is currently the vice chairman and partner at the Global Infrastructure Partners, a fund that invests across the world in infrastructure. As president of the World Bank Group, Dr. Kim embarked on major reforms and shaped and reshaped, I must say, the vision of the bank to focus on two critical issues: ending extreme poverty and achieving shared prosperity. Under his incredible leadership, the World Bank invested heavily in education, in health, in pandemic preparedness and prevention, and also on infrastructure. Dr. Kim served as the president of the Dartmouth College, United States of America, as professor in public health at Harvard University, and he was earlier a director at the World Health Organization. He co-founded what's called the Partners in Health, an NGO dedicated to health. He's well known for his pioneering work on the treatment of HIV/AIDS, and what they call the 3x5 initiative, which was acclaimed for being the first effort to globally tackle HIV/AIDS. Beyond his global leadership and expertise, Dr. Kim is a great friend of Africa. As president of the World Bank, he prioritized Africa. Jim, of course, is a personal friend of mine. He and I traveled together, I wish we had the photos to show for it, to Ghana, and we dressed, I think, my Lord, you were there then at that time in Ghana. We dressed in kente dress as twin brothers when we went to Ghana. Then was President John Mahama was president of Ghana. Jim epitomizes how multilateral development banks should work together. When I was seeking for general capital increase of the bank, we traveled all the way to Korea for that meeting, and I needed to get some support. Jim was president of the World Bank Group, got on a plane, and flew all the way from Washington to Korea. He came to Korea, Busan. He addressed all the shareholders. He made a very passionate case for the African Development Bank to get a general capital increase. And he said, well, Akin is actually doing quite a lot of reforms, more than I was doing at the World Bank, so you should give him more money. And of course, I was quite delighted. He finished the meeting, he got on his plane, and he flew right back to Washington. And of course, our shareholders eventually gave us that capital increase. And just tells you a lot about the person. He showed commitment to Africa, commitment to working together instead of competing. And I need to underline that in terms of working as a system, but also a commitment to a friend. Jim walked the talk. He is eminently qualified to speak to us, therefore, today about how the global financial architecture needs to be reformed and how the multilateral development banks need to work together as a system. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming my dear friend, our 2023 Kofi Annan Eminent Speaker, Dr. Jim Yong Kim. Kim, over to you, Jim.
Thank you so much, Akin. It's wonderful to be there. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, I didn't hear anything back, but I'm assuming that you can all hear me. It's great to be with you. Honored guests, President Adesina. I'm just incredibly honored to have been asked to give this lecture series that honors Kofi Annan. You know, I had the singular privilege of meeting the Secretary General, first through my work at the World Health Organization in scaling up AIDS treatment in Africa and other developing countries. But then later, after he retired, I was able to spend some quieter moments with him. You know, I've always thought that the Secretary General's role in bringing AIDS treatment to Africa has been woefully underappreciated. You know, it's even these days, 20 years later, President George W. Bush is finally getting the kind of acknowledgement that he deserves with this presidential initiative. But I rarely hear about just how critical the Secretary General's role was, especially in getting the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria started. It was the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, who made that happen. And, you know, putting my World Bank hat on, I really shudder to think what would have happened to the economy of sub-Saharan Africa if we hadn't gotten the nearly 20 million people on treatment who are getting treatment today. You know, my mother was a scholar of Confucianism. She was a philosopher and studied Confucianism. And Secretary General Annan always reminded me of the great Confucian sages that she would tell me about: kind, compassionate, and wise beyond measure. Also, I want to thank my good friend Akin for those wonderful, kind words. You know, it was really such a breath of fresh air when he took over as president of the African Development Bank. We began working very closely together right away. And I'll never forget the very first panel I ever served on. I think, Akin, it was at the United Nations. And he started with just such a wonderful story. He told about the very first time he went to the United States. He landed in the wonderful town of West Lafayette, Indiana, the home of the great Purdue University, one of the greatest engineering schools in the country. And he rented a room from a professor. And every night, he diligently ironed his shirts and ironed all his other clothes and did it very early. And sometimes even before he had dinner. So the matriarch of the household one day, and this is the story, Akin was telling the story to the group. One day the matriarch of the family asked him, Akin, why are you so diligent about every day coming home and ironing your shirts? And he said, well, I want to get them ironed before the electricity goes out. And so the matriarch smiled and said, you know, here in West Lafayette, the electricity tends to stay on for most of the day. This son of a farmer from Nigeria has come so incredibly far. And yet, right after he spoke, I was able to speak. And what I said to him was, you know, King, you actually misunderstood the question. What she was asking you was, why on earth would a graduate student iron his shirts? I'm, you know, having been a graduate student in the United States myself, I'm sure that Akin was the only graduate student on the entire campus who ironed his shirts ever. You know, as you see, and as all of us soon learned, President Adesina is by far the best dressed multilateral development bank president in a long time. I think, in fact, it goes all the way back to Bob McNamara. Bob McNamara was dressed almost as well as Akin with the bow ties, but he's by far the best dressed and dare I say, best looking as well. So I'm so grateful to be able to do this with Akin. And generally speaking, when he asks me to do things, the answer has always been yes. You know, when we were working together, one of the goals that we shared was the commitment to ending extreme poverty by 2030. And when I left the World Bank in 2019, we were making slow but really steady progress toward that goal. But of course, COVID, which I think we can now say was the worst disaster of the last century, actually has put that goal probably out of reach. Global GDP shrank by 4.3% in 2020. 70 million more people were pushed into extreme poverty, an increase of more than 11%. Now, just to give some perspective, the spike in poverty was 4 times greater than the spike in poverty after the Asian financial crisis. But beyond the effects on mortality, economic growth, on poverty, the impact on human beings, the impact on our reserve of human capital has just been devastating. Many of you may know that in my last years at the bank, we started something called the Human Capital Project. By human capital, we mean simply the health, skills, knowledge, and experience that people accumulate over their lifetime. Human capital has intrinsic value, but it also makes people more productive. It makes economies grow more quickly. It's basically wealth embodied in people, and for many of the poorest, it's the only wealth they have. Human capital accumulation is both sequential and cumulative. One stage builds on the previous stage, and you have to invest in human capital over the entire life course. The most critical period of human capital accumulation, of course, is when people are young. We started the Human Capital Project first to understand what is the contribution of improvements in human capital to economic growth. And what we found, and it shouldn't surprise anyone, is that human capital is one of the principal drivers of economic growth in developing countries. We then went on to quantify how countries were doing in building human capital so that we could compare them to one another. Now, comparisons and rankings are always controversial, but people pay attention. And the local press picks up on rankings because they like to compare themselves to neighboring countries. So we started off our Human Capital Index with very simple measures. One was on education that focused on both quality and quantity. We called it learning adjusted years of schooling. Another indicator was childhood stunting. Another was childhood under 5 mortality. And then finally, we looked at adult mortality. The first index was published in 2018, the second in 2020, and because of COVID, the next index has not come out yet, but it's still a very active ongoing project at the World Bank Group. And I suspect that there's work on the Human Capital Index and the Human Capital Project in other multilateral development banks as well. Did it work? Did it have its impact? Well, let me just give you a couple of stories. So first, by the time the Human Capital Index came out, my dear friend and now finance minister in Indonesia, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, she was in place as the finance minister. And I told her, Sri Mulyani, the childhood stunting rate in Indonesia is over 30%. She was shocked. Of course, having worked at the World Bank and being such a brilliant person, she knew very well the implications of having a stunting rate over 30%. She was shocked, and so she put in place, along with President Joko Widodo, an aggressive program to reduce childhood stunting. And between 2018 and 2021, they reduced it by 6 points, results that we've seen in other countries as well. So in Indonesia, that was one very specific example of how this ranking, how these numbers had a direct impact. Nigeria is another story, Akin's home country. We were talking about the fact that the human capital indices in Nigeria were so low, despite the fact that Nigeria was an oil exporting country. And so when the rankings came out, we knew that the Nigerians were going to be very low in the bottom 5 of the ranking. And we were wondering what they would do. And with other ranking systems, with other indices, what we would hear from the lowest ranked countries is critique of methodology or critique of the exercise in and of itself. But something else happened. The vice president brought all the different ministers together and said, look, we've got to tackle human capital in a much more aggressive way. So I think it did have some impact, but I would also say that it's just really important to continue to monitor human capital because, one, it's so important for economic growth, but it's also, I think, access to health and education is just a basic human right. So what was the impact of COVID on human capital? We have some idea. There are 14.9 million excess deaths, enormous psychosocial stress leading to spikes in mental illness, domestic violence, teen pregnancy, and early marriage in many parts of the world. The greatest impact, of course, is on young people. In early childhood, we know that the first few years are really critical for brain development, and that the brain development during this time lays the foundation for literacy and the learning of mathematics. Childhood stunting is so important because when a child has a 2 standard year, nutrition got much worse, and in many countries, the reports of childhood. The reports of portions of food for children were really quite sobering. In Sierra Leone, 68% of children had smaller portions of food. In Kenya, 69% had smaller portions of food. And in Bangladesh, tragically, 100% of the children had smaller portions of food. Healthcare. Because of the lockdowns, very young children missed vaccinations. The percentage of unattended births went up. Many stopped going to preschool. Also, there were 75 million new orphans in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia because of parental deaths from COVID. Unprecedented stress in families created difficult home environments, and the direct declines in testing of toddlers, for example, lagged far behind. In Bangladesh, the difference between toddlers in 2022 and 2019 were frighteningly large. The observed changes in healthcare, in learning, in schooling, in childhood stunting, et cetera, if not remedied, could translate into as much as a 25% reduction in earnings when these children are adults. What about school-age children? So among school-age children, more than 1.3 billion children lost at least 6 months of schooling due to COVID. In wealthy countries, the switch was made quickly to online learning, and we're finding out that even though the vast majority of children in OECD countries had access to the internet, there were still losses in learning. But in a world where 2/3 of children in the world do not have access to the internet in the home, you can only imagine how poorly that switch to online learning went in developing countries. Learning losses happened at all income levels. 1 day of school closure led to 1 day of loss of learning, except among the poorest countries and in the poorest households. Because not only did they lose that year of learning, but they forgot the things that they learned before. So they went back even further, and therefore inequality in loss of learning got worse. School dropouts were also a major issue. The poorer the household, the more likely the young person would be not to return to school. What about in older youth, in youth from 15 to 24 years old? Well, there were deep employment losses, and there were differences in both the percentage of unemployed and the rapidity of reemployment after COVID. And of course, the poorer the country, the poorer the household, the worse the outcome. The so-called NEET, N-E-E-T, not in education, employment, or training, that number went up very high, very much in developing countries. In OECD countries, what often happened is that when restaurants closed or when other places of work closed, young people took the opportunity, and with the amounts of stimulus financing, the fiscal spending that you saw in so many of the different countries, they use that money to get training in other fields or to continue their education. Of course, in developing countries, what you found is that people fell into the NEET category, not in education, employment, or training. And of course, this is further erosion of human capital. Now, if we can get the first slide up. So the first slide, I just want to pay tribute to my colleagues and my friends at the World Bank Group. They published this wonderful study called Collapse and Recovery. This is the cover of it. And if we can go to the second slide. The second slide shows that in order to get back to the trajectory for human capital development the countries that were on before COVID, children will have to learn more each year than they would have before COVID. This is extremely difficult. Excuse me. Okay, now we got, and let's go to the next slide. Right. So this slide shows that in order for countries to get back to the trajectory for human capital development that they were on before COVID, they're going to have to learn more each year than they would have before COVID. this is going to be difficult. It's going to be more difficult for the poorer countries. And so how do you get there? How do you take educational systems that may have been struggling before and get them to perform at even higher levels? Well, the measures are well known to anyone working in the multilateral development bank system. Transfers for the poorest households, catch-up campaigns for vaccinations and nutrition. And there are some countries that have done quite well in terms of catch-up. Pakistan, for example, has done quite well. Should be integrated across sectors. And these new systems should be agile, resilient, adaptive. They should always reach the most vulnerable. And the systems themselves should have the mandate and authority to coordinate across all the sectors, resolve conflicts, be data-driven, and be better than they were before COVID. Now, I think this is a wonderful report. I think these are wonderful recommendations. But then what is the role of multilateral development banks? And I just think there's no way to get around the realization that there really are not great market-based solutions to solving the problems of lost human capital from COVID. The MDBs are going to have to step up. And also, I think that compared to the UN system institutions, of course, are wonderful. I've worked in them myself, but they do tend to be very focused in, the World Health Organization focuses on health, UNESCO and others focus on education. It's very difficult for those organizations to think system-wide. And I think the multilateral development banks and the African Development Bank in particular are especially well-placed to think about building those overall systems. And I think that, again, from all the research that we've done in the Human Capital Project, it's clear that investing in human capital is going to be a very powerful driver of economic growth, at least in the medium and long term. Now, what about the traditional focus on infrastructure? Well, the multilateral development banks will always have an important role to play. But let's just take a look at what kind of scale we're talking about, how we're going to be able to meet the needs going forward. So President Adesina has talked a little bit about, what's needed. The number I've heard is that finance needed for just climate-related activities in developing countries is total of $2 trillion. I think Akin said there was 1.2 in Africa. So if you look at 2019 and 2020, there was a total of 30 billion of climate finance that came into to Africa. And of that, only 4 billion came from the private sector. Now, we know that we have to have much more of financing coming from the private sector flowing into Africa. But starting at 30 billion, when much more is needed, and then only 4 billion of that coming from the private sector, what are the prospects of reaching the levels that we need to reach? So in the process of trying to, as we say, crowd in private sector capital, I think the African Development Bank has done some really innovative, exciting things. The synthetic securitization program that transferred some of the non-sovereign loan books to the private sector, wonderful, creative program. With the support of the UK, I've heard of the risk transfer transaction of sovereign debt of almost US $2 billion to support with scaling up climate finance. Wonderful. New asset classes, great initiatives. And maybe I thought I would just take the final few minutes of my talk to kind of report back. So, I'm a multilateral development bank person. I grew up in some very significant ways in that system. So some of you may know I also have a PhD in anthropology. So let me just give you maybe an anthropologist's report of what I found now being out in the private sector, trying to bring that money into our particular fund. My fund inside the company I work with is an emerging market infrastructure fund. The group I work for is Global Infrastructure Partners, and it was founded by fellow countryman of Akin's, a gentleman by the name of Adebayo Ogunlesi, probably the most brilliant human being I've ever met. He built this company from nothing, over 100 billion in assets under management. And the original idea behind the fund was to invest to a great extent in emerging markets. But they were so successful in OECD countries that they kept investing in those countries. And by the time they were able to turn around and sort of saying, okay, what about our emerging market structure? Their funds were so large that they had outgrown the size of investments that could be made in emerging markets. So I was recruited. My friend Jin Yong Sai, who was head of IFC, we joined, and we went about trying to raise money for the Emerging Market Infrastructure Fund. And this is now we're working for a company that has 100 billion assets under management, incredibly successful. Here are the questions we got. What about currency risk? Isn't it expensive to hedge currency risk in emerging markets? What about all the various forms of political risk? What about rule of law? How do we know governments won't nationalize assets? What's the premium you'll offer in terms of return in order to justify the much higher risk we're taking by investing in emerging markets? The number we heard most often was, you have to offer us at least a 5% IRR premium for us to even consider investing in your fund. Will local investors allow you to make any money? Do you have boots on the ground? How well do you know these countries? So what we learned was that it's difficult, and it's been I'd say a little bit unsettling and discouraging to see how many misconceptions there are about the situation in developing countries. And so, we learned some really hard lessons. For example, when I was at the World Bank, we had many meetings on impact investing, and I was told by various people, oh, there are trillions of dollars waiting for opportunities to do impact investing. I can tell you at the level of the CIO, the Chief Investment Officer, and below, where allocation decisions are made, there's tremendous amount of skepticism about impact investing. And lest you think that this skepticism is coming from hard-hearted billionaire bankers, most of the negative responses came from really public employees who ran these pension funds. And what they told me was this. They said, look, we understand what you're saying. We understand your passion. We understand why impact investing is important. But we cannot take the chance of failing to build the pension plans of teachers, police, firefighters, in order to invest in some unproven notion of impact for people in a far-off land. This is what we've been hearing all too frequently. But look, there's also great news. There are wonderful opportunities. The countries that we're investing in are growing rapidly. There are wonderful opportunities in Africa. But we're going to have to do a lot more, and a lot more together, to realize the promise of bringing the kinds of private sector funds that Africa deserves. My dream is that someday we'll make these investments. The investments will have such a positive impact on economic growth that the returns will be very strong for investors. But the countries will have grown so much as a result of these investments that everyone is happy. Once we have that sort of situation, the investors will come pouring in, and the virtuous cycle will go forward. I hope that someday, very soon, all of us together can celebrate that. Groups like GIP, the Global Infrastructure Partners, private investors, the African Development Bank, and people in the developing countries themselves. One day soon, I hope we can celebrate this virtuous cycle that brings to Africa what it needs, but more importantly, brings to Africa what it deserves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give another warm round of applause to our chief guest. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for that thought-provoking, empowering, and inspiring lecture. And I know that the audience here, they've got comments and questions. We'll come to that for Dr. Deshna and Dr. Kim. But just to say, when you're listening to both leaders, you got that urgency and seriousness with which the world needs to tackle what Dr. Deshna referred to as the leakages around climate change. Tackling the fact that 2.3 billion people around the world go to bed hungry. And of course, the inability to cope with pandemics. And then that picture was driven home by Dr. Kim, who spoke about the impact that COVID-19 had on a place like Africa, expanding the digital divide, the impact on education and on employment. And of course, he wanted to tell us about how to reverse the human capital losses that were caused by COVID-19. And of course, we won't forget the early remarks that Dr. Kim said of Dr. Deshna. The best dressed, the best looking. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, let's give it to him. And for Dr. Kim, let me just tell you another title for Dr. Deshna. This one I will use a story which happened recently by a UK publication called The Guardian newspaper. So they interviewed Dr. Deshna about 2 weeks ago, and they put out a very elaborate article. And then they had a different headline altogether. After about 2 hours, they decided, no, the best headline to go with is Africa's optimist in chief on Africa's renaissance. Don't believe me? Believe data. And data was correct. In about 2 hours, they realized the audience reading that story had doubled from 20,000 to 40,000, and the figures were rising up rapidly because of that title, Africa's Optimist in Chief. So data was right. A big round of applause. And thank you also to our audience online. They're already bringing in their questions. So may I first of all request Dr. Deshna to join me on the stage for a conversation with Dr. Kim. I'll ask just a few questions, but then we'll have a microphone next to you, the audience here at the headquarters of the African Development Bank headquarters. Be ready with your question. We'll come to you. But maybe the first thing I'll do is to ask Dr. Deshna, if you could just give us your reflections of what you've heard from our chief guest today, Dr. Jim Yong Kim.
Thank you. Yeah, it'd be good if I could see Jim on the screen.
Yes, please. We can get Dr. Kim back on the screen. That would be very good.
Yeah, is Jim on the screen?
Yeah, he should still be with us. Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, my brother and friend, thank you very much. That was a fantastic. Thank you very much. And you look cool too. It looked like the stress of the World Bank went down after you left.
I wore my best suit and my best tie, but I still look so shabby compared to you.
Well, thank you for a phenomenal lecture, and thank you for the insights that you gave us, Jim. And I just wanted to say a few words about where you started off in terms of human capital. Human capital is the basis for everything. Otherwise, we will all not be here. Education matters, skills matters, institutions matter, and how we finance education is a big issue. And the point that you raised about a lot of kids that came out of school or fell out of school because of COVID, it's an issue that we have to recreate. Again, get kids back into school and also make sure they have fantastic infrastructure to support learning. And when one thinks about education, one of the things that I think about is, how do we better link that education to the skills of the marketplace? We've got today 477 million young people that are between the age of 15 and 35. And in Africa today, we have a challenge in terms of a third of those are not employed. A third of those are underemployed, and a third of them are simply mad with governments. Okay, so I think that issue of, yes, we invest in education, but also we've got to invest to make sure that we reduce the skills mismatch between what the educational systems produce and what the needs of labor markets actually have. And the second one, of course, is that we often emphasize, and perhaps way too much, just formal education in the sense of going to universities and all of that. I think if one looks at experience of places like Germany and so on, where you have a lot of industrial development, they focus a lot on technical and vocational training. And that's why for us as a bank, we're investing quite heavily in technical and vocational training. That's very, very important. And just to tell you also that I think we need to also make sure that we create financial facilities that support young people. They've gone to school, they come out of school, but where are they going to get the capital to set up their businesses, you know? And sometimes I feel that young people go to technical vocational education, they finish all of that, at the end of it they come out and so what? You know, then you train me some more, but there's no finance for me to go set up my business. And I wanted just to share with you an experience that I had with our common friend, President Kagame, and you were there. What's the name of that, your school again, in the Global Health University?
University of Global Health Equity.
Yeah, and many of you may not know, University of Global Health Equity is the chancellor of that university. It's based in Kigali. And he was telling me earlier this afternoon when we're talking that in the rankings that he gave, I think it came fifth. I think is it global, whatever, it was one of the top. Eight, okay,
yeah,
all right.
London Times Higher Education Ranking.
Good, I just promoted you 3 steps. You got work to do, Chancellor. So, but I wanted to tell you about an important point of this issue of financing for young people. President Kagame told me that we supported something in Kigali called the Kigali Institute of Science and Technology. And I went to see him, and this is a program where we put in $40 million. They have scholarships, they support kids, students to go to school. And then one day he said he was jogging at about 8:30 at night in Kigali, and there was a young lady jogging the opposite direction and wanted to say, "Hi, Mr. President." And of course, they pushed her aside. And she said, no, Mr. President, you sent me to the Kigali Institute of Science and Technology, which is a program that we have, I think, with Carnegie Mellon. I think it's a joint program. Yeah. And I want to tell you what I'm doing now, what I want to plan to do. And he said, okay, bring her. And she came along, and he then asked her to come to the State House, and she went to the State House, and he said he gave her a little bit of money, some small amount of money just to encourage her, and that's okay. And she went. And she said, I never saw her again for more than 2.5 years. And after that, she came back one day and called, and they let her into the State House, wanted to see the president. He said, Mr. President, the business that you supported me to do just about 3 years ago, I just sold it. I developed it and I sold it for $21 million. And she's 27 years old. And of course, I told President Kagame, can you please tell all African heads of state to jog at 8:30 at night and make sure that he invests in health, in education for young people. So really your point there is really fantastic. I also want to emphasize what you said about malnutrition with a practical example. You know, I remember when you and I and Bill Gates, you remember we were talking about investing in gray matter infrastructure, where the issue is not just about infrastructure. We can build roads, we can build rail, we can build ports and so on. If they're bad, we can fix them. But I remember that conversation you and I had about the neurons, and I remember you pulled out some documents for me at that time to look at how neurons work, that if you actually have those things affected, you can repair them. And that's where, that came up with our issue of let's invest in gray matter infrastructure. And a practical example, Jim, I wanted to give you is, I went to Madagascar in 2017? What was it? 16, thereabout. And when I arrived, we went on a helicopter. We got to this particular village, and there was all these kids that were excited. They ran towards the chopper, and my eye just got fixated on one little kid. Seems to be a little bit more exuberant than others. And I bent down and I said, what's your name? And it told me his name. But what surprised me was the voice that was projected. Because I thought this kid couldn't be more than 5 years old. So my name is Anthony, but the voice was so strong. I said, how old are you? He's an 11-year-old kid, but so stunted. So you can imagine when Dr. King was talking about the impact of what stunting does. I think for our economies, we lose anything between 5 and 11% of our GDP as a result of stunting. And I asked him, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he said he wants to be a doctor just like you, okay, and so on. So I said, okay, there's no way you're going to be a doctor at this particular age with this level of stunting. So I picked up my phone and I called my wife and called Grace, your friend. So I said, Grace, I'm in front of this kid. This kid is stunted, severely stunted. And there's just no way this kid can be anything with this level of stunting that you have. You are giving the statistics about what was done in Indonesia and all of that. And I said, can we adopt this kid? And of course, the line went dead. And I said, honey, are you there? He said, yeah, I'm there. You can go ahead and adopt the kid. And so we did. Well, Anthony today, he just passed his exams, he's going to university now. He's taller than myself. Yeah. And he wants to be a doctor just like Dr. Kim. I'm just trying to say that about the importance of what you raised in making sure that we get resources, not just for education, but very early, education. And one thing I also say is about girls. You and I, you know very well the point about early marriages and how that affects girls in school. I think so. Those are points that I just want to say. And 2 points I made before we open it up. You talked about the issue of the COVID. And Dr. Kim is so right, because I think the COVID situation, as he's very well explained it, created divergences between developed countries and developing countries. And we're still coping with that, even today. And of course, for us in Africa, Jim, we still have a tapering effect of about $435 billion a year that we need to cope with all those effects that you were talking about. Then on top of that, now we got climate change. On top of that, now we got conflict, we got inflation, we got debt, we got all those things. Like when it rains, it just pours. And so all the more reason why the global financial architecture needs to deliver a lot more financing for Africa, concessional financing, a lot to deal with issues of debt, issues of climate, issues of health, all those things that you very well mentioned in your point. And the last thing I just wanted to say is the issue of getting private sector in. You're spot on, because, as I said in my opening remarks, Africa has about, let's say, $2 trillion of assets under management. Globally, we still have about close to $145 trillion of those assets under management. But when we say we want to attract that, I think a number of things, you're clearly right, needs to be done right. First is, where are the projects? Which projects are we going to be financing? So a lot needs to be done in developing bankable projects. And you work in infrastructure firms, so that's important. Second is the risk. And I always feel that risk, in most cases, sometimes it's like people stand out there and they make perceptions of risk elsewhere that they don't understand, right? And you cannot really assess things unless you actually have an understanding of that market. And I remember when I was learning how to swim, and they told me that the end of the pool was the most risky part, and that I was going to sink. I was so scared. But when I went to the deep end of the pool, Jim, I found out it was the easiest part of the pool was the deep end of the pool. So if you know your neighborhood, I don't think you'll be so scared of risk. And I think talking of data, we did something, I think it was Moody's Analytics that we asked to look at the risk of default on infrastructure financing globally. And Africa has the lowest level of default globally, right? So I'm making that because I think there's a difference between the real risks. There's also the difference between the passive risk. I think the passive risk for Africa is high. And as a result, Africa pays today about 700 basis points higher in terms of what you call the Africa premium, in terms of being able to generate much financing. But anyway, thank you very much, my friend, for those very stimulating points that you raised. And I think that your point on multilateral development bank, yes, we have to work better as a system. We have to make sure we deploy our capital better. We need more capital, but I would say we need more also callable capital, but paid-in capital, because you need risk capital to be able to leverage a lot of the private capital that you were talking about. So thank you very much, Dr. Jim.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, for that. The next question is for Dr. Kim, but I've got to say, earlier on we heard how Dr. Kim, as the president of the World Bank Group, flew to Busan in Korea to join the African Development Bank Group's annual meetings. And at that time, this is what Dr. Kim said. I want you to know that there's no way we are going to achieve what Africa deserves without a stronger African Development Bank, the continent that deserves so much and deserves precisely what a bigger, better, more efficient, more effective African Development Bank can deliver. In 2019, that came to pass with an increase in the capital increase of the bank. So the question here is, Dr. Kim, the bank is preparing to celebrate its 60th anniversary next year, its Diamond Jubilee. What's your advice as to where the bank should be in the next decade?
Well, I of course defer to everyone there and know more about it than I do. But here's just a few thoughts. I thought it was extremely bold for President Adesina to go forward with the capital increase. I thought it was, first of all, a great idea, which is why I flew all the way to Busan. But also, I went there. And although it was the board, it was not necessarily Korea, but I wanted to, in the country of my birth, go there and give a personal testimony to the great faith that I had in him as an individual and the African Development Bank as an institution. I think the African Development Bank needs even more capital, right? So as I'm out there looking at sort of the various instruments in the world that are trying to tackle things like loss of human capital as a result of COVID and the infrastructure deficit in Africa, the lack of energy in Africa still, there is no better bargain for the world than to invest in the multilateral development banks. I mean, the formula is really very simple, and the way that we educated our constituents when we were going for the capital increase at the World Bank was, look, for every $1 billion of paid-in capital, the bank can lend $1 billion each year with long tenors and low interest rates. This is the best bargain that you can possibly have, and I think it's really critical for multilateral development banks to not be shy about teaching the world that of all the things you can put your money into, putting $1 billion into an MDB will let you multiply the impact of that $1 billion over and over and over again. So I think, first of all, just be even bolder than before, right? I think the next question is, so how do you work closely with the private sector? How do you use these innovative tools to crowd in capital? So, let me just give you a couple examples. So we started working on things like project preparation facilities, right? And the project preparation facilities, people say, well, you need bankable projects, so let's create a project preparation facility that's a group of people that work at the multilateral development banks. But the thing is, the kind of project preparation that's done by people who are not professional investors who are doing this all the time is not the same as what we do inside Global Infrastructure Partners. I have to tell you, among the most, what's the right word? Among the most intense, the most intellectually challenging, the most stimulating meetings I go to are our investment committee meetings. The kinds of questions that are asked are so incredibly difficult. I mean, we usually start off with a question, so if this is such a great investment, why are these people selling it? So the kind of work that's required to get past any reasonable, decent investment committee is very complicated. And so for the multilateral development banks, having to go in and work with the MDBs over a long period of time, going through the project preparation process of an MDB, it usually is not going to work. On the other hand, if there are sort of, sort of easily digestible tools, like, for example, first loss facilities or, credit enhancement or other things that don't slow the whole process down, then I think multilateral development banks can play a hugely important role. What I'm hearing now, and I think my friend Ajay Banga gave a great speech. I think he's going to be a great World Bank president, and he said directly that he's going to go and ask for more capital. The most important constituents, I think, said, great, we're agreeing with this, we agree with the vision, but just no more capital. I just don't think that is going to work. So more capital, figure out ways of working with the private sector that are so user friendly that the dream that we've always had, that private sector capital will come rushing in because the World Bank and the African Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank, all these different banks just make it almost irresistible to invest in emerging markets. That is not happening yet, right? Let's try to find projects where we actually do that. I've been obsessed with the possibility of building the Grand Inga Dam forever, just because there's a possibility that we could double the access to electricity in the continent. And of course there are environmental concerns, but over 90% of all potential hydroelectric power plants in the United States are already built and already functioning, and in Africa it's around 1%. I think that this is one area where we can explore. Is there a way for us to build a consortium with the African Development Bank at the center, build a consortium that can get a project like that done? So complicated, so requiring of really broad efforts at having governance that will work in a situation like that. If we could make that happen, that would be transformative. So, again, I'm a huge believer in the MDBs. I think the MDBs should be, screaming it at the top of their lungs that invest in the MDBs, and that's where you're going to have the biggest possible impact. But, let's make it work. Let's make it work with the private sector.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, Dr. Adesina.
Yeah, just thank you very much, Jim, for that. I think on the point of the MDB, I think I'll agree with you that the MDBs are essentially leveraging machines, right? If you take a look, for example, at the African Development Bank, we just worked together with our colleagues at the Inter-American Development Bank, looking into how to better optimize the special drawing rights, the IMF use special drawing rights. And of course, my sister Kristalina is doing a fantastic job there at the IMF and all of that. But out of the $650 billion of IMF, of the special drawing rights SDRs issued, Africa got only $33 billion. It's probably about 4.6% of that for a population. It's about 1.4 billion people. Now, the question really is, how do we make that work for us better for all the things, whether it's in infrastructure, water, sanitation, health, education, all the things that you said? We've got to be able to multiply that several times. And the model that we came up with will allow those SDRs to be leveraged 3 to 4 times. So you can imagine if it's a $10 billion allocation that's rechanneled from the developed countries to Africa via the African Development Bank, a $10 billion becomes $40 billion immediately. That's the kind of scale that we should be talking about. And you were talking about some figures in the beginning about the SDGs more generally, that we need, maybe $3.5 trillion to deal with that. I think, Jim, that the fastest way to do that is to get the instruments that we have right now to work better in a world that's rapidly changing, in which there's limited resources, but the needs are huge. So you can imagine if you had a situation wherein the SDRs were, let's say you got $500 billion of SDRs that were issued, and a lot of that goes through multilateral development banks, and based on the model that the African Development Bank developed, which is a global public good today, that you can get up to 4 times. And that is $2 trillion right there that will deal with a lot of these issues. So, I've mentioned to even Kristalina, she came by here to see me, and I said, look, we are all into development. Macroeconomic stability is important, fiscal stability is important, all the development issues are important. But even how we change these instruments to work better, if we do it that way, perhaps we could even change the name, adjust the name, and call it supporting development revitalization. That's an SDR also. It works at scale. So that's one part. The other thing I want to say also is what you said about the issue of project preparation. There's not enough resources being put into project preparation. And I really, we have from the bank a facility here that's called the NEPAD Infrastructure Preparation Facility. That preparation facility, we used it, Jim, and And our leverage on it, I think, was about 23 or 26, 27, okay, I thought it was 23, but 27x times in terms of the amount of downstream investment we are able to leverage from it. So we should be putting a lot more money into that. And that's why the African Development Bank is struggling, supporting the Africa 50, which I chair the board of it, and doing a fantastic job. They have a project preparation facility. Now, we're talking about INGA and we're talking about green infrastructure. We've just launched something, we designed something that we're going to launch. Actually, we're discussing it with our board. It's called the Alliance for Green Infrastructure. And that alliance, Jim, will be able to actually interface with the global infrastructure partners a lot because it's about green infrastructure. So whether you're greening the transport system, or you are improving efficiency of electric efficiency in buildings, or you are doing renewable energy, which is what you, as you mentioned, or in green metals to be able to do electric vehicles and all of that. Now, the good part of this is that this is all, Jim, going to be all private sector. And so $100 million of that, $100 million, I'm sorry, will be on project preparation, right? The other one will be on project development for about $400 million. So that's $500 million for project preparation and project development. But then we will use that to leverage $10 billion of private money to go into infrastructure. Whether it's ports, whether it's rail, whether it's digital, or whether it is it's hydro that you mentioned. So just one thing to just keep in mind on that. But just to end, I'll say that we need to work better as multilateral development banks with ourselves. When you were president of the bank, we did what I think was a real fantastic initiative, which is this MDB exposure exchange, in which we had risk concentration in Africa, and therefore we were able to swap some of our risk in our portfolio with the World Bank, and we also did with the Inter-American Development Bank. You know what that did for us? That allowed us to free up $10 billion right there of headroom for the African Development Bank. So we should be doing more like that. That's how we optimize the system. And you said it in your opening remarks, and thanks for mentioning that the UK, Andrew Mitchell, the minister, you and I know him very well, he's a good friend, he's a fantastic guy. We were able to do a $2 billion synthetic securitization, wherein we essentially took risk on our sovereign portfolio and transferred it to the private sector. And that freed up $2 billion again for us to be able to invest in climate resilient infrastructure. The last one we are doing today is with MASA in Asian Development Bank. We're working with them in an exposure exchange for $1 billion. Again, that will free up space. So I think we've got to make sure that the MDBs work together as a system. When you were president of the World Bank, I remember we had a meeting with what's our friend in Singapore, Thurman, who is now the president of Singapore, about how we have to make sure that there is effective synchronization between the system, from the macroeconomic stabilization, fiscal stabilization, up to the MDBs, multilateral development banks that are working on more sectoral issues. So support IMF, support World Bank as they deal with the global issues, but also significantly support the regional development banks. And thank you for what you said about the African Development Bank needing to be a lot of resources. In fact, our common friend, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, said recently that the African Development Bank should be lending, what did he say, $100 billion a year. And so I think what you said is really very much appreciated. So thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you for that, Mr. President, and also Dr. Kim. I promise that I'll come here for some questions, but I want us to restrict that to just one question. So if you've got your question ready, the microphone is right there. But as we come to you with a question, we've got Susan Lado online monitoring the proceedings very well. But I think, Susan, your question has already been answered in terms of the framework of special drawing rights and what needs to be done to support Africa. Dr. Deshna has dealt with that one emphatically. Are there questions here, please, or comments? Let's make it quick. Yes. Okay. It seems I will get one more question that has been sent in, Mr. President, online. And this is from Mohammed Msekeni, who says, lower to middle income countries are subject to rising debts in response to challenges post-COVID-19, climate change, and conflicts. Which financial models will be sustainable for growth and recovery between carbon offsets and loss and damage insurance compensation? Maybe you can go first, and then we'll hear from Dr. Kim.
No, let the eminent speaker speak first.
He went off video. Can we have our
Dr.
chief
Kim
guest
back
back on video, please?
Go ahead, President Deschner, you go ahead.
Okay, all right, good. Well, thanks very much. What's the name of the person who has the question?
It's Mohammed.
Mohammed. Well, thank you very much, Mohammed, for your question. I think there's no doubt that debt, but I'd like to talk to Jim, because it's my
Yeah,
guest.
let's get Jim's video back on, please. That's not Jim.
I like your face. You're handsome too, but I think
let's get Dr. Kim back
Dr.
on the
Kim
screen,
on
please.
Yeah. But I think the whole issue around the debt is a very, very important issue we have to deal with. And before I come to your point, I think we have to understand the reasons why we're having a lot of debt these days. You know, after the global recession, there's a lot of cheap money that was given available. So interest rate went down, right? So it was cheaper to actually borrow a lot of money. And many countries actually went that way. And in our continent, for example, I think probably between 2008 and 2019, you have maybe about 25 countries that went into Eurobond markets and borrowed heavily, and maybe about $150 billion. So the era of cheap money. But then, of course, as you have a tightening of monetary policies in the EU with the ECB, but also in the US, you find interest rates that are now going up, and therefore the cost of repaying back that debt has continued to rise. And so I think more generally in trying to deal with debt, the debt issue, I would say three things. First is that we need to recognize that you can't run up a hill carrying a backpack of sand on your back, right? And so for all the things that you mentioned today, I think we have to find a way of debt resolution very quickly that reduces the amount of debt, that's hanging on the back of many countries. The G20 Common Framework, Jim, that was put out, it's a brilliant one. And, but then what you find is that in you at the World Bank, you have the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. You also have the highly indebted poor country things that we all support. But what actually happens is when it comes to restructuring debt in Africa, it is incomplete. It is very onerous. It takes forever to do it. Africa experienced a lost decade when all those restructuring were delayed and so on. So I think we need to find a system that is much faster in trying to do debt restructuring and debt resolution. And I applaud all the efforts that have gone into the G20 Common Framework. We have, I think, Zambia that was done. We also have Chad. I think we have, but we still have Ethiopia and Ghana coming up on board and so on. So I think we support that. I strongly support that. But I think it needs to work much faster, much better. The other part of it, which I think is very critical, is that we need to make sure that a lot of the reasons why this debt is been accumulated in Africa is because of infrastructure. And countries are borrowing heavily for infrastructure. The question is, why must government alone be doing infrastructure, right? Infrastructure should be done also by the private sector. That will reduce the amount of debt burden that countries have to. So there's a policy issue there about how we make sure we open up the space for private sector in energy, in transport, in digital infrastructure, and all of that. I think that's a very critical thing for the issue of the debt. But finally is we've got to also mobilize a lot more domestic resources. One of the areas that's very difficult for us on infrastructure, and of course you are the global infrastructure partners, is how do we come up with instruments that can scale in terms of local currency financing for infrastructure? Because you have a mismatch in terms of a lot of infrastructure, maybe it's energy, in which you're generating a lot of revenue, but you're generating that revenue in local currency that continue to depreciate. And of course, as the exchange rate weakens, then the amount of money you have to pay back in debt continues to go up. So I think that's a big agenda for all of us to figure out how to get local currency markets to work, local capital markets to work, and also how to see how we can hedge and swap a lot of that to be able to work for us at scale. But on the issue that was raised by saying on the carbon offset and the I think he was talking about loss and damage. Well, my view is that carbon offset is like putting bandage on a bad sore. Okay, you need a bandage. There's no doubt about it. But you need to make sure that you're dealing with the sore itself. I take, for example, if somebody you have cap and trade, right? If somebody is emitting globally a lot of carbon and then goes to another part of the world that's not actually emitting and then buys an offset, okay? Well, that doesn't stop the fact that that person continues to emit globally. So that's one part of it, right? It's almost like greenwashing of your conscience in terms of global emissions, okay? And second is, it is the person that is emitting who actually dictates the price they pay for the carbon. And so you got in Africa today, you probably get about $7 a ton for carbon. But if it's in Europe, you probably can, some places it can be as high as $200 per carbon, for carbon. So there's that issue that we have to deal with. The third is, I noticed there's quite a lot of things going on today where countries are giving up their land to several other countries to do carbon offsets. Yes. But let's think about it. You shouldn't be seeding your countries out, part of your countries out for carbon offsets, because you actually need the same land to be able to be properly valued in terms of your carbon, to be able to measure your green wealth. And Jim, when we were at the Africa Climate Summit, I said Africa is natural resource rich. Forests. Take a look at the Congo Basin. It is bigger and vast in terms of carbon sequestration than all of the Amazon taken together. Most people don't even know that. But Africa gets absolutely nothing for that. And so we have to change to how we measure the wealth of Africa. In my view, the worst thing to happen to us globally in terms of climate, all the things we're dealing with, is how we measure wealth. We measure it wrongly. Gross domestic product is the wrongest measure of wealth in a place where you're dealing with externalities of biodiversity loss, forest loss, and also carbon emissions and all of those things. Because you are rewarding the wrong thing. Okay, I can be wealthy at the cost of the environment, but I don't internalize all of those externalities. And so what I'm pushing for, and what I asked with the African heads that said I agree for, is why not remeasure Africa's gross domestic product based on the natural capital that Africa has? If I took all the carbon sinks that Africa has, and you actually have a shadow price of carbon on that, and you measure it, guess what happens? The re-indexed gross domestic product of Africa goes up for those countries that have a lot of carbon sinks and all of that, which is a global public good. Then the debt to GDP reindex goes down. So places like Gabon, places like Cameroon, places like Congo, all of those countries that are now listed as high-risk countries, but in fact they are nature-rich but cash-poor, will suddenly have a lot more resources to be able to invest more green into their economy. So I think we need to start thinking and rethinking about how we measure Africa's wealth. We must measure Africa's wealth with green wealth. And that is the only way, as far as I'm concerned, that all these things that we say we are moving from billions to trillions will happen. Because we turn African economies green, but we measure the value of African economies properly. And then local carbon markets will develop, regional carbon markets will develop, and everything will be able to work very, very well. I know that I have discussion with my colleagues at the bank. People talk to me about the case of the debt for nature swap. As you know, they have one, I think it was in Ecuador or something like that, a big one. Fine, yes. But if that nature is important, Why is that nature not part of my wealth? Why is it that it's just dealt with that way? And so there's a fundamental need to relook at how we measure wealth. And so all I'm saying to you is loss and damage, yes, when people talk about loss and damage, I don't think people can do that, but as far as I'm concerned, the trillions that Africa needs, today, we get only 0.3% of all the global green bonds, $653 billion in Africa. Why? Because we are not investing, we are not directing the economies green. And I think by basing it based on green wealth, rebasing the GDP and creating those internal incentives will allow us to go there. That's where the trillions, in my view, are going to really come for Africa. So, but not, there are other things that are inframarginal. I don't think inframarginal things, as interesting as it may be, they are not big issues for me. I think the issues for Africa is we've got to be structural, we've got to be systemic, we've got to be able to scale, and we have to make sure that whatever we do is also sustainable.
Thank you for that, Dr. Adesina. And I know, Dr. Kim, you are listening to that carefully. Maybe you want to build on some of the points that Dr. Adesina has just made.
Yeah, a couple of just quick points. So first of all, this idea of natural capital accounting, it was an idea that we took very seriously when I was at the bank. And, I frankly, unfortunately, I just don't think it's advancing quickly enough. And I completely agree with what President Adesina said about, let's get serious about it. Let's really, we have the tools to do natural capital accounting. This is something that now has been developed a lot. But, what are the direct implications of that for African countries? There should be many. And I started advocating for much larger sums of money going into Africa in the late 1990s, and it was around HIV. And I just want to remind people how crazy we were at the time in thinking that it would have been okay to deny treatment for HIV for people in Africa. I mean, frankly, when we started the 3x5 movement, literally 99.999% of the infectious disease doctors in the Western world said it's impossible to treat HIV in Africa. And, luckily, Secretary General Annan, really spurred on by Jeffrey Sachs, started the Global Fund. But the real change happened with President Bush when he started the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And that was so unexpected. And at first, we thought it was so out of character. But having gotten to know him and his father, it was almost a religious experience for him. I mean, he thought, I cannot turn my back on 25 million people living with HIV. What did we learn from that? Well, the outcomes with antiretroviral treatment in Africa are better than they are in the developed countries. Everyone said it's impossible. You remember the head of USAID said that, Africa, they can't do HIV treatment because there's no concept of time in Africa. They don't have watches. They don't, if you tell them take something at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, they don't know what they're talking about. This was in a testimony to Congress. It's on video. I played it for people so many times. And so we ignored and looked down upon and underestimated Africa for so long in so many different ways. And now we almost take it for granted that 17 million, 20 million people in Africa are on treatment. But the fight to get there was really difficult. I think we're in a similar fight now. I think we're in a similar fight to ensure that Africa has the resources it needs. And, think about what would have happened if we would have made the incredibly stupid and morally repugnant mistake of not treating HIV in Africa. People in Africa would have been gone to other places looking for life-saving treatment. And there would have been crises everywhere. But, fortunately, we did the right thing. So getting really practical, let's look at the Grand Inga Dam. The problem with Grand Inga has been that the only assurance of a power purchase agreement was to build long transmission lines to Nigeria, to South Africa. And that made it impossible because, they would just, if you said, well, okay, we're going to build this dam, it's going to, the first phase of it's going to be 20 gigawatts. And the power purchase agreements are going to come from South Africa and Nigeria and other places. There's no way that you would have gotten the kind of debt financing on the global markets because those are not credible power purchase agreements. So we went around, and this is something that we've been doing completely separately from the work that we do at Global Infrastructure Partners. It turns out that aluminum manufacturers are desperately looking for clean energy so that they can sell their aluminum as green aluminum, right? And so, in speaking with Rio Tinto and speaking with the folks in the United Arab Emirates and in China, there are multiple companies that said, if you built the Grand Inga Dam, we would relocate our aluminum factories to DR Congo, especially if you can create the kind of special economic zone around it that would be required. And we will give you long-term power purchase agreements that you can rely on, and more importantly, you can take to the global capital markets to raise your debt financing, right? So this is new. I mean, this is a new idea, and this is precisely what it would take, I think, to get something like that off the ground. So, the first phase, 20 gigawatts, maybe half of it you would sell to the aluminum manufacturers, and they would be willing to commit to long-term power purchase agreements if you could give them clean energy, and the cost that we're talking about is 2.5 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour if you're right there, in the Congo, getting it as it's being produced. So let's try to make something like that work, right? Bring in the private sector to do things, that might have been unexpected. Provide the kind of long-term power purchase agreements that would give the assurance that you can go to capital markets and raise, the 20 to $25 billion that you need, and then think about how many coal-fired power plants would you take offline if you could make that work. The number is staggering. Eventually, you could get to 50 gigawatts and more, right? So let's do specific things like that that will show that the multilateral development banks, the European Union, France, China, the United States, they would have to come together in order to make something like that work. You could buy turbines from General Electric, turbines from France. You could have China participate in some of the construction work. There are all kinds of ways of making this work, and it would take tons and tons and tons of carbon out of the air, and it would also illustrate that organizations and countries and private sector, the MDBs, could work together on something like this. And so this is what I would just urge, that we have a lot of wonderful, brilliant meetings talking about things like natural capital accounting, talking about things like carbon offsets. Let's do things that actually change the game. And there's a lot of opportunities out there to do just that.
No, thank you very much, Jim, for that. And I'm glad that you brought up the issue of Inga as we close, because at the end of the day, it's all about let there be light, right? And there will be light. And then that's the only way you can get economies working. And I don't know if you know this. Do you know the meaning of Inga?
I don't.
Okay. I went there, and I went to the village there, the community, and I asked them, what's the meaning of Inga? You know what it means? It means yes. And so as I was leaving, they gave me the golden book to write, and I wrote. I said the African Development Bank says yes to Inga. So I'm saying yes to what you're saying, and I think. In addition to the fact that we can get multiple players to do industrial development, I do think we do need to work on the issue of transmission lines between countries. Absolutely. One of the things that we are doing today with Africa 50 and the African Development Bank is in Kenya, we're doing the first PPP power transmission line, all done by private sector, right? And I think that if we, for example, look at South Africa and all the other countries throughout which all this power out of the Inga will go, as long as those countries, Jim, agree to have cost-reflective tariffs and all of those things and improve their utilities, we literally can bundle all of those things and issue bonds, power transmission bonds, to finance those transmission lines from private sector across those countries. It's a big project that we need to do, and look forward to how we can work with the global infrastructure partners on that. And as you know, we are doing the Desert to Power as well, which is a $20 billion investment with several partners to develop 10,000 megawatts of solar that will provide electricity for 250 million people. I'm glad the EU ambassador is actually here, because a lot of these things require de-risking. You said it earlier, the force laws to be able to de-risk many of these projects. It's very, very important. So we look forward to seeing how we can work with EU. They have this fantastic regional infrastructure financing projects that they support us and others on. I think we can use some of those force laws things to do. But let me say that I know that we now have to close. Please, I would like you all to kindly join me in really thanking the African man across the screen from me. He has a heart for Africa. He has shown incredible leadership when he was at the World Bank. He continues to, even at the global infrastructure partners, continue to look for ways to just explain the issue of INGA, ways in which we will continue to support Africa. He is a friend of the African Development Bank. Jim, I can never forget what you did for me when I was looking for General Capital. You're my friend for life. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I'm told that I have to find a way of you getting this. And so I hope it's a 3D thing that we can project to you. But let me read it for you, Jim. Appreciation and recognition from the African Development Institute of the Bank for an outstanding lecture delivered on the 20th of October 2023, The Changing Global Development Finance Architecture Implications for Multilateral Development Banks Post-COVID, presented to Dr. Jim Yong Kim, Vice Chairman and Partner of the Global Infrastructure Partners and the former President of the World Bank Group. Thank you very much, Jim. This will be sent to you. Thank you very much. Let me use that time to also thank all the excellencies that are here, the executive directors that are here, vice presidents. Let me please kindly thank Vice President Arama and his team for putting together a fantastic session here. And Jim, you're not in this hall, and one of the guys that is here, I think you would know him, is Max Jarrett. Max Jarrett used to be director working closely with Kofi Annan's office. So I just see him beaming as you were saying, you and I were saying great things about Kofi. Once again, on behalf of the executive directors of the African Development Bank, the staff and management of the African Development Bank, and on behalf of myself, your friend for life, thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. President, for that. Thank you so much, our chief guest, Dr. Kim, for your time, for your insights. Very refreshing, very inspiring, and of course, empowering. I think this is why I told you this was going to be a memorable Friday afternoon, a lot to take away from this. Now I'll tell you what's going to happen next. And first of all, let me recognize the presence of His Excellency, the Ambassador of Ghana to Cote d'Ivoire. Feel most welcome, sir. Yes. So now, next, we are now going, now that we've, Mr. President has formally closed the session, we are now going to have a family photo with invited guests who are here. After the family photo, we will go upstairs for some refreshment. And let me just tell you one more thing when you go away. Let us meet in Marrakesh, Morocco, because you heard about bankable projects being mentioned. The African Investment Forum is headed to Morocco from the 8th to the 10th of November. That's where serious money meets transformational projects. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Okay, so let's go for the family photo.